Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to session 409 of Humanity Rising as we enter the third day of a 5-day program on endangered species. Yesterday, we had a very powerful program that featured work going on under the sea with orangutans, with cheetahs, with a very powerful program. And it was Sylvia Earle that pointed out that most of life on Earth is under the ocean surface, in the cold and in the dark. And that really kind of exploded in my mind some very deep questions about the nature of our humanity, the nature of our relationship with other life forms. Then Claire this morning told me about a Twitter feed of a forest ranger in Africa who takes care of cheetahs in the forest. And each night he sleeps with the cheetahs. And he kept this quiet for a long time, then began to tell people about it. No one really believed that you could sleep with wild cheetahs who are predators. So they set up a night camera, and sure enough, each night, a little group of cheetahs, adult males, come in and snuggle in. And it's just a powerful example of the boundaries that we think normally demarcate ourselves from other species are actually very porous. We have an extraordinary opportunity in our time to redefine who we are. It's worth noting that Jane Goodall, who worked with Louis Leakey, as you know, in the Olduvai Gorge in Kenya, and then went down to the Tumbi Center looking at the chimpanzees in the 50s and 60s. After her research, she did a PhD at Cambridge University. And in her doctoral dissertation, she referred to the chimpanzees as he's and she's, and she had given them names like Old Gray, if you remember her original work. And the doctoral dissertation committee at Cambridge objected to her dissertation because they said you can't call an animal anything but an it. And to give them names was a violation of scientific norms. But Jane took them on and persisted. And one of the breakthroughs that she demonstrated, as you may remember, because up to that time, people thought that the distinction between humans and animals was that we could use tools and they could not. And it was Jane Goodall that showed the first evidence of chimpanzees using tools. Many of you may have seen in the news over the last couple of days videos of chimpanzees actually applying medicine, leaves that they chew up. They apply the medicine to other chimpanzees. And there's many examples of that around nature. So as we contemplate the fact that, there's 1 million species under threat right now in the world, including our own, it's important, I think, to just hold that we're part of a interactive, interconnected ecology of being, and that the distinctions between human and animal, human and bird, human and fish, human and life is much more porous. So as we define ourselves in our modernity, I think it's important for us, particularly in a week such as this, to go back to a very primordial understanding of the interconnectedness of all being. It's in that spirit that I invite you to just take a moment, as we always do as we commence our Humanity Rising sessions, to just take a breath, center yourself in your body, attune yourself just for a minute with your heart. Listen to your heartbeat. And as you listen to your heartbeat, just feel the connection with everyone else on the program, coming in from well over 100 countries today. And more broadly, attune yourself to the chimpanzees, the orangutans, the cheetahs, animals that you know. It's all one. Thank you, everyone. Now, with a heart full of gratitude for each and every one of you, and thanksgiving for life itself out of which we come, we want to contemplate today on our third day our planet and look at some of the issues related to climate change. So I want to welcome our conveners, Tom Eddington, who's the founder actually of Endangered Global, and George Capinelli, the founder of Age Nation, who've been working together to put this week of programming into motion for Humanity Rising. Tom, George, welcome. And thank you so much for the quality of individuals that you're bringing together for this week.
Thank you, Jim. Welcome, everyone. It's been a terrific week so far. We started on Monday talking about we're living in the 6th mass extinction. What are the implications of that? Yesterday, we had a phenomenal panel where we discussed the million species on the endangered species list and came out of that session with a sense of hope that for the first time in human history, we actually have the knowledge to understand what's going on planet Earth. We don't have all the information, but we have enough to know that there aren't unlimited resources on the planet. There's a finite set of resources. And with that information, at least we're in a position to do something with that knowledge if we choose to. Today's session, as Jim mentioned, is Planet Earth. So we want to think about two sides of the same coin. One side is biodiversity and the biodiversity loss that's happening on planet Earth. And the other side of the coin is planet Earth and the climate change that we're experiencing. Much of it being driven by the human activity and human activity being the catalyst for that climate change. And tomorrow we'll focus on humanity and humanity's role in flipping that coin willy-nilly and the impact that it's having both on the climate as well as the loss in biodiversity. We have an extraordinary group of individuals with us again today. John Leary is joining us from Trees for the Future, Washington, D.C. based nonprofit that's focused on alleviating poverty and hunger in much of the world, and have come up with, over their 30 years, an extraordinary set of models where they're using microfinance and women's empowerment and agroforestry and other models to not only reforest, but to get to the heart of the matter around poverty alleviation and hunger. Cyril Cormos is joining us from Wild Heritage. He's the founder and executive director. And Cyril's done an amazing amount of work in his career to really understand what's happening with climate change, and has helped us really understand the importance of preserving, protecting old growth forests first and foremost. And then Cyril will share more about some of his research and the work that he's been doing in his career. And finally, we're joined by Wilford Welch. Wilford is an author, an academic, a retired diplomat, and has dedicated the last 20 years of his life to helping move humanity into action around climate change. And welcome, Wilford. So as I've shared the last 2 days, there are approximately 850 bioregions providing habitat of Earth's biodiversity. And we're in the 6th mass extinction. And the science and the wisdom traditions are telling us that if we can preserve half of the nature in those approximately 850 bioregions, we can actually, in this decade, we can actually stop the 6th mass extinction. And the question is, how do we take the knowledge that's known now and what was shared yesterday that has provided hope to Dr. Sylvia Earle and other leaders in the arena, and how do we move that hope, move that knowledge into action? And so much of our conversation today is going to be with Wilfred, Cyril, and John sharing what they're doing, what they've been doing. And I'd like to hear from each of them a bit about their background, and to share with you how hopeful they're feeling and what are some of the actions that they and their organizations are taking to make a difference. So John, let's start with you. If you could share a bit about your background and how you're feeling about the state of the world.
It's my great pleasure to be here, and I'm feeling a lot more hopeful when I'm with groups of people like you all with the shared interest. It's hard to be hopeful. We every day are really losing this fight. Hunger has accelerated throughout COVID. Deforestation and degradation continue as well. So the greed behind it, the other drivers behind it are surmountable, but it's going to take a lot of work. So I'm grateful to be here with all of you to see how we can indeed do that. I appreciate the words that you said about how we got to look at the water and the oceans as well. And I actually, coming out of college, I was very passionate about marine ecosystems and coastal ecology, marine biology, and I spent a lot of time snorkeling down in reefs and identifying things. And I quickly learned that our problems in the ocean are caused by land, and it's either sewage or runoff or agriculture, fertilizers, livestock manure, you name it. A lot of our degradation in the seas is coming, and so I tracked it on the land, and here we are 20 years later, and 2 decades of agroforestry work. A lot of what I learned about agroforestry, I learned in the United States Peace Corps, and I would highly recommend everyone who's trying to put knowledge into action to join the Peace Corps. And it was there where I learned a lot of wonderful skills that I carry on today. And it was there too that I first met the founder of Trees for the Future, Dave Dettner, who started this fight many decades ago before all of us, and the founders of Trees for the Future. And they said, serving around the world, they saw this environmental disaster happening in the 70s and 80s, and they're looking around and nobody was helping to plant trees. So Trees for the Future got started working and supporting people to plant trees on all kinds of ways. And here we are, the organization is 30 years old. And what we've learned in 30 years of tree planting is essentially the forest garden approach. And we've seen that today with the farmers that we work with across East and West Africa. This approach that we've packaged, and I'll talk more about it later, but it's packaged in books and a website and download it in the app. And this approach that we're replicating in many different countries right now. We've got 40,000 forest gardens. We're trying to scale it to 100,000. We've got a tremendous program that's building. That's been our one key push moving forward. So from my own kind of personal career and figuring out how can I have the greatest impact, and also helping the organization to do so as well. There's a lot of ways to plant a tree, and there's a lot of ecosystem restoration that needs to be done. But we found that by working with smallholder farmers, who comprise, most of the farmers around the world, they're producing much of the food. We're able to work with them in ways that not only help the planet, but also eliminate hunger and extreme poverty within a relatively short time. And so it's people, profit, planet, social, economic, environmental. I think our contribution here is finding ways to say, how can we consider all of these other truly important socioeconomic impacts, all of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? How can we achieve many of those, through single approaches or single initiatives, not just tree planting, but the agroforestry program that we're happy to share. So we've seen it. We have thousands of families that we have helped rise out of hunger. We've seen the land restore, the ecosystems restore. Somebody said earlier, we know how to do this, and I think we're happy to be in the group today to be able to share what we're doing, how we're doing it, and see if other people can be able to run with it as well. So yeah, thank you, Tom, and I'm looking forward to getting into it more with the rest of the panel.
Thank you, John. Cyril, would you like to share a bit about your background and how you're feeling about the state of the world?
Sure, thank you, Tom. Excuse me. So my name is Cyril Cormos. I'm based in Berkeley, California. As Tom said, I run a very small nonprofit called Wild Heritage, founded just a few years ago with uncanny timing just before a major pandemic. But we're doing a lot of great work that I'll share in a second. I just want to pick up on something that Tom said about climate and species and biodiversity being two sides of the same coin. And Tom said that almost casually, as if it was a given, and it is a given. But the point is that was not a given just a few years ago, and that people are starting to understand the extent to which these two global crises are, at least on land, completely interwoven and really the same issue if you start to dig into it. And so that gives me a lot of hope, because that is actually something that is now being recognized all the way up to the UN Climate Convention and decisions taken over the last 2 years, that you have to think of ecosystems and climate change as two sides of the same coin. That's an important breakthrough, and we can talk about why that is and what the implications of that are. The problem, as John said, is that we need to be moving much faster. And so, it's good to have these breakthroughs. This is a breakthrough, of course, that Indigenous people made about 15,000 years ago. So we're now sort of catching up with Western science. But that's still an important point. What we're seeing here is a convergence of traditional ancient wisdom with modern science. And I think that's potentially an extremely powerful convergence and a big moment. So that's great. What does not give me hope, and what is still an issue, is that although people understand that, broadly speaking, biodiversity and forests in particular and climate change are inextricably linked, the range of or the particular mix of forest management activities that will give you the biggest bang for the buck is not well understood, in particular with respect to climate change. So there's a blizzard of quote unquote forest solutions out there: burning trees as biofuels, logging better in old growth forests, thinning forests in the backcountry to try to fight forest fire. A lot of stuff that is, at best marginally helpful and at worst seriously counterproductive and a waste of time and money. Planting millions of cloned trees in the backcountry as a replacement for clear-cutting old growth forests isn't going to work. That doesn't give you any biodiversity benefit or any climate benefit, at least not over the next 30 or 40 years when it matters most. So the good news is we've got a broad understanding of the importance of ecosystems and how they relate to climate. And I'll say that the convergence is not just around climate and biodiversity. The convergence is around climate, biodiversity, social justice, pandemic, water. All these issues are converging, and that's a very exciting thing. However, the point where they converge the most is around old growth forest, because these forests, which are undisturbed by industrial activity and still contain essentially all or the large majority of their biodiversity, these forests maximize the benefits. If you want the cleanest water, if you want the lowest risk of disease transmission from animals to people, if you want the most carbon, if you want the most stable carbon, if you want the most species, all of those things require a primary forest. So what my organization is doing, and we also run a coalition called INTACT, International Action for Primary Forests, is to try to prioritize primary forests in international policy and to get people to understand that these places are unique, they're irreplaceable. We can't bring them back over any time frame that makes any sense for solving either the biodiversity or the climate crisis. We need to solve these crises in the next few decades. Replacing a primary forest takes centuries. So it can't be done. And there is no way to manage an old growth forest with bulldozers and chainsaws and to do it sustainably. It doesn't work. It's never worked. It hasn't worked anywhere. And so the real priority is to get these places protected, and to do that by any means that's effective. It can be indigenous conservation, it can be community conservation, it can be a park, it can be a place managed by the government for the services it provides. So there's really no one mechanism that's best, but we need to protect these places long term. And the second highest priority is restoration, is to bring back forests wherever we can, and in particular, and this is a really important point, to understand that the most effective restoration in the short term is to bring back a degraded forest, to allow a degraded forest to recover. Because although planting seedlings can be useful, over 30 years, seedlings, over the next 30, 40 years, when we need to solve the climate crisis, seedlings won't draw down a lot of carbon dioxide. They'll draw down some, but a medium-sized tree growing into an old tree, or a medium-aged forest allowed to mature over the next 40 years will draw down a lot more carbon dioxide. So speaking specifically from a climate and biodiversity standpoint, and there are lots of other reasons to plant trees, and there are lots of other reasons to do restoration, from biodiversity to solving hunger problems like John is doing, to prevent erosion, et cetera, et cetera. But specifically for climate and biodiversity, the biggest bang for the buck is primary forests and allowing a degraded but existing forest to age and recover. So that's what Wild Heritage does. We're trying to integrate these two priorities in international policy. And we also do a lot of work on the ground in the US and Canada, and with World Heritage sites around the world. But I'll stop there, and we can maybe pick those up later. But thank you. Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Cyril. And Wilford, over to you.
Sure. Let me tell you quickly about my journey over the last many decades. I was a US diplomat during the Johnson and Nixon administrations, focused on China and the rest of East Asia. And after that time, I moved to a major consulting firm. And for many, many years, I worked with either corporations like Citibank and Toyota on their international business strategies, or I worked for governments, from the Bolivian government, actually some work in Iraq, but primarily to Korea and Taiwan on their international strategies relating to their electronics industries. And I felt I was doing some very, very important work in terms of helping corporations in their profitability globally, and helping countries in terms of helping their citizens in their economic development policies. But around the turn of the century, I began to think that what I was doing had a dark side. And what I mean by the dark side is that I was supporting economic growth at all costs. And the costs was to people like indigenous peoples around the world and planet. which is obviously the subject of what we're talking about. So I've really fundamentally shifted my attitude towards and my passion. I spent the first decade of this century focused on the global sustainability crisis, which was touched on, which is now, when I was born, there were 2 billion people on this earth. Now there are 7.8 billion people. Everybody wanting more and more on a finite planet, particularly water and agricultural land. Okay. And that is totally unsustainability, and that's the sustainability crisis at its macro level. And then as I was doing this work and the analysis and the way I approach things is driving forces, looking at the economic, social, technological, and others, cutting across the disciplines in a holistic fashion, as opposed to just one particular going deep in one area. I became very clear that global warming and climate change was going to take us down if we didn't deal. So I really shifted much more of my focus and my writing, et cetera, and my teaching. And I wrote a book called In Our Hands, a handbook for intergenerational actions to solve the climate crisis. And I wrote it in 2017. And then I went to a business school here, Presidio Graduate School in San Francisco. And I said, you are not really focused as hard as you need to focus on the major issue that's going to take us all down, and that managers of corporations and government entities have to be aware of. And after beating them down for a couple of years, they said, you are 100% right. Let's all work together. The result was that I rewrote this book for teachers, K through 12, throughout the United States. And we have a program called Climate Essentials for all teachers, K through 12, in the United States, because of the notion that climate science is not something you just teach in, or the climate is not something you just teach in the science class. It's an economic issue. It's a social justice issue. It can be taught as part of art. It can be taught in literature. It's a way of infusing in our young students understanding of how, 3 things, how they need to understand that there's fundamental changes taking place in the world that they will inherit over their lifetime. And it will not be pretty. And they have to be aware of that, and they have to be given the proper science and the other things in their classroom. That they have to have an opportunity to go into professions and activities that they can be part of the solution and not be the victim of what's been going on. Okay. And the third is, and this is really critical, that they be given hope. They must feel that their actions and all of our actions will lead to a hopeful future and a fundamental, I call revolution, small r, big E, evolution. We need to move to that next level when we need to do it really fast. So all of my energies these days is working with these teachers. I was last night from 4 to 5 p.m. And that'll be what I'll be doing the rest of my life. And I'll stop right there. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilford. Thank you all. George, you look like you've got a question or a comment.
Well, a few. First of all, John, Cyril, and Wilford, it's really a pleasure having you join us. And each of you is doing such really extraordinary and remarkable work that the world needs. And each in your own way have stressed something that I'd like to stress a little bit more, and that is time is not our friend in any of these conversations, whether it's the education factor or the old growth factor or the biology and the biodiversity factor, whatever we're dealing with requires instant alert attention and deep commitment, and not just on the part of individuals like you who are doing extraordinary things. So in some ways, my comments are directed to an extraordinary group of people who are watching today. And first of all, to thank you for the chat that you're creating. As always, it's deep and meaningful and expands this conversation. And I want you not to give up hope either, because the chat in the future, as humanity rising evolves and changes, is going to become much more integrated into the programming, because we know it's a fundamental and critical part. One more comment to you, those who are watching and listening. As each of these dialogues progresses, I ask you to keep asking yourself, how can I do more? What can I do to be involved? Whether it's in old growth forests or education or whatever the topic is, because we, the people in every country on this planet, need to be much more involved. Dialogues between activists and legislators and governments only are partially effective if our voices are not constantly heard, because we are the ones ultimately that can determine the future by what we do and how we do it.
Yep.
So I just want to really encourage that as we go through this conversation. It's vital and it's important and it's critical. And listen between the lines to the specifics that each of our speakers are talking about. Arthur Rubinstein once said that there are plenty of people that can play the notes, but the real music happens between the notes. And that's true in each one of these dialogues and each one of these conversations. This is important stuff. A couple of quotes that I want to read you. One is by Wendell Berry, who says, "If you're fearful of the destruction of the environment, then learn to quit being an environmental parasite." And that's true for many of us, unconsciously. We don't realize what we do each day either mitigates or contributes to the destruction of our planet. Franklin Roosevelt, a long time ago, said, "A nation that destroys its soils destroys itself." Forests are the lungs of the land, purifying the air and giving fresh strength to our people. There are many people, if you Google some quotes on the environment, you'll be amazed at the number of people who have been guiding us, warning us, pleading with us for a long time. The Dalai Lama said, "It is our collective and individual responsibility to preserve and tend to the world in which we all live." So with that as the spirit of what we're trying to do today, let's go back to our panelists and find out what else they have to share with us about the things we can be doing that can support the things that they are doing, so that hope does get returned to the generations that follow us. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, George. And I think for many of us who were watching COP26 in Glasgow last fall, came away with the sense that COP was a flop. And it was a flop because the world leaders who were there are completely trapped and caught in the systems that we all are living in and they're trying to lead from. And so, stealing Wilford's book title, we came away from COP26 realizing it is in our hands and it's up to us. That our leaders are, for a variety of reasons, are not able to do the things that need to get done. And so John, you had your hand up. I'll turn it over to you to start the dialogue.
Hearing everybody else talk, I'm dying. You know, if we were in a room together, I'd be talking over people and jumping up and down. I think we're all, excited to see some change and want to see it happen. I'm happy to add a little bit more in our experience is that, we need to talk about food systems here, where it all comes together. We talk about farming, we talk about agriculture. I think food systems are this kind of multidisciplinary, world where it's important to be getting, education around sustainability, starting in schools and earlier, because there's so many different ways that that the degradation is being driven. I'll share. We have a panel of authors here. I also wrote a book. It's called One Shot: Trees is Our Last Chance for Survival, and this came out in 2017. And every word is still true, and everything that we talked about is still happening. And we've planted a 250 million trees at Trees for the Future. So we've been, for 30 years, we've been looking what's causing the deforestation and the degradation. And what we've seen consistently is, and I started earlier talking about smallholder farmers, they're half the problem. Smallholder farmers slashing, burning, chopping, clearing. They've oftentimes lost a lot of the more sustainable techniques that generations had earlier, and they've been mimicking the big guys, the big agriculture, which is also just causing so much degradation on this planet. And when we look at the food system, it's not just the monocropping, an acre at a time or 100 hectares at a time or 1,000. It is the agriculture, which is putting a lot of stress on old growth forests and everywhere else. But behind that, it is the markets. It is the people. You just keep asking why. It's because at some point in history, agriculture turned into agribusiness. And agribusiness is people financing it, is greedy people trying to make money. It's advertising that's skewing what we're looking at. And it's hard to know, if you don't, and this is kind of the punchline here, is if you don't know where your food is coming from, it's almost most likely hurting somebody somewhere. It's most likely being grown in ways that's destroying the soils, it's hurting the water. And so it is in our hands. We all do need to figure out. And I remember when I came out with my book, I was standing on stage and some smart student at University of Maryland raised her hand and said, agriculture, food system, destroying the planet. John, where do you get your food? And I said, well, I spent the last 2 years writing a book. Like, I'm buying it at a lot of the same places everybody else has. And so that's a whole thing. Where do I get my food? Which farms do I go for the meat? I've had to kind of go through that whole exploration in my own personal life. And we all need to do that, making sure that we're all sourcing food from farmers who are growing things in regenerative ways. And my last point here is our contribution and what we've figured out, helping smallholder farmers like Rose here in East Africa to grow crops with trees and nitrogen fixing trees and everything else. A lot of these same nature-based solution, agroforestry solutions are exactly what the big agribusinesses need to implement as well. Nitrogen fixing trees, more regenerative growing techniques. We do have it all. I think it comes down to all of us doing whatever we can in our professional careers, but also at home and in our own lives, making sure the day-to-day, because our contribution to climate change is most likely the biggest thing is through our food, is the food that we buy, the impact that it has, however it's grown, the chemicals used, it's transported, the refrigeration, all the way to our house, the cooking it. When you look at the size of that, the climate, the contribution to climate change from the food system, I think that's it's a key place that we need to tackle. Yeah. And when you talked about the international agencies struggling to make an impact, it's because you got a lot of strong, powerful businesses that are selling the seeds, buying the food, doing the advertising, doing the marketing, and we need to get a lot of big players in tune with us, in tune with how people can grow food sustainably, regeneratively. I see Wilford's been throwing his finger up there for a little while, so I'll pass it off. But yeah, thank you for helping me infuse the food systems and the concern around them into the conversation.
Go ahead, Wilford.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. I want to pick up on what you said, Tom, when you were talking about Glasgow. And it is very, very obvious that governments, national governments, whether they are democracies like the United States or the totalitarian regimes like a China that has more top-down authority. The same problem. All governments are seeking to satisfy the wants of their own people. That in the United States, for example, in political terms, means that the national government will not be as effective in Glasgow because the politicians are pandering much more to the needs of individuals who are their voters. And a totalitarian regime also has to be responsive, or it loses control because people are protesting that they're not getting enough from their government. So when you go to Glasgow, you're always going to do less as a national government because you're focusing on the wants and needs of your own people rather than the wants and needs of the world as a whole. That gets me to the fact that the revolution that has to occur has to be that mobilization that Jim and this organization is doing to, we are the ones that are the problem. We are the ones that are the solution. We have the technology, that's not the problem. The problem is us, whether it's voters that we were talking about that relate to the Glasgow situation, or it's any other problem. Every single person on this call from 100 countries and more, all 7.8 billion of us, whether we like it or not, have to fundamentally do 3 times more than we're doing now. That includes the panelists, that includes me. We all have to step up to the plate. There's nothing in the way of our stepping up and getting this job done. We are not doing the job. And the problem is that we only have about 10 years to change our behavior and do what I call is focus, choose, act. Focus on what is ours to do, choose specifically what we're going to do, and then take action. You could tell I'm on a roll, but I'm going to stop being on the roll and pass it on to some other people, and maybe we'll pick up on some of my comments.
Cyril, you want to jump in here and just talk a bit more about what's being done and what needs to be done around protecting the old growth forest?
Sure. Thank you. I'll just first pick up on a quick point about the need for more public attention and grassroots activity, and I think that's really important. And in my experience going to these UN meetings over the years, what I notice is that the government representatives in the room come into the room, start their deliberations, they take a quick look to the back of the room, and if they just see a few scruffy activists there like me, they're not too worried. If they see a solid, informed press corps and a lot of people paying very close attention to what's in the media, then you have a different discussion. And so, from a political standpoint, what changes the discussion is shining a light on what's happening at the higher levels in government. And that's hard to do. And what it requires is a media pool that's very educated and informed. And it requires a public that's pretty well educated and informed and up to speed on the issues. And that's a challenge, because there's a blizzard of information out there and not all of it is very good. I think that is why, my focus is on information and communications as step one to inform the policy debate, because bad information and inattentive, public leads to bad policy every time. On the question of how much is being done to protect primary forests, old growth forests, undisturbed areas around the planet, it's a roller coaster ride. The good news is that there is some increasing attention being paid to protecting large scale ecosystems. But again, it's one step back, 2 steps, 1 step forward, 2 step backs a lot of the time. We've seen some wonderful, amazing, enormous landscapes protected around the world. in recent years. And then we've also seen some catastrophic decisions, large scale infrastructure going into some of the most iconic World Heritage sites around the planet. So it's a little bit frustrating. The core of the debate and what will determine whether we can protect a lot more is understanding of the concept of ecosystem integrity. And this applies to primary forest. The higher the degree of ecosystem integrity in your ecosystem, so the extent to which that ecosystem is undisturbed by infrastructure, industrial activity, industrial extraction, and it still retains its original species and its original vegetation structure and its species composition and all of those things, determines whether that particular ecosystem will deliver the ecosystem services that we want. So that's a complicated way of saying the more ecologically intact your ecosystem, the more it delivers for people. Unfortunately, for decades or even centuries, the dominant paradigm in forests has been to log them better and to argue that industrial logging is going to be sustainable, and that's what's going to solve all our problems. We're going to log sustainably and generate an income stream, and that money is going to flow to people on the ground, and so sustainable logging is going to save our forests, and frankly, we can't afford to do all this protection and preservation that all the tree huggers are talking about, so logging is the way forward. Unfortunately, that hasn't turned out to be sustainable. You can't log an ancient 700-year-old tree sustainably. You can't log an ancient forest that's been evolving for centuries to millennia sustainably, because even if you can sustain some timber out of that forest, you can't sustain the soils, you can't sustain the carbon, you can't sustain the biodiversity, you can't sustain the interior forest microclimate, you can't sustain all the things that it takes centuries to create. So what's really going to get us to the next level in terms of protecting the big wilderness areas and the still intact areas of the planet is understanding that ecosystem integrity is vital, and that it's simply not consistent with things like industrial logging or forest thinning or burning for biofuels or a lot of the other solutions, quote unquote, that are being thrown out there. So there's a mindset shift that needs to happen around what works and what doesn't to protect, old growth forests and other, primary ecosystems. So that holds true for wetlands, grasslands, seagrass areas, whatever it is, whatever ecosystem you're talking about. So we're making progress conceptually, people understanding that ecosystems are important. We're getting, to the point where people are understanding that bigger is better and we need to protect more. We're still stuck on what are the activities that are going to actually generate meaningful, real protection over the long term. And unfortunately, that requires a paradigm shift in how we approach ecosystems and how much industry goes into some of the world's last wild places. And until that shift happens, we're not going to win this fight, because we get back to the same point where politicians say, okay, yeah, I understand ecosystems are important, but let's be realistic. We still need to, get our bulldozers in there. So, we get what you're saying, but don't ask for too much, and then you're back to square one. So, just to wrap up, we do see that large-scale protection is possible. Governments are still protecting very large, extraordinary places, from Colombia to marine areas to Canada to Russia. We're seeing very large, wonderful, extraordinary landscapes being set aside, often with indigenous management or co-management or ownership, or all forms of indigenous protection. So it's possible, and that's encouraging. It is absolutely possible, but it requires a mindset shift, and it requires funding. And actually, the last thing I'll say very quickly is, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars every year on industrial subsidies for industrial agriculture, for mining, for logging, for oil and gas, not to mention defense. And then we spend trillions on fighting pandemics and climate change and trying to, mitigate the environmental damage that we've caused. So the idea that we can't pay for conservation is absurd. The money is there. What is not there is the political will to get it to the right places. So it's, it's a really important point, because we've been conditioned to think of conservation as a luxury, as something that's a fringe, as, something that is, detracting from the global trajectory and not something we can really afford. And that's nonsense. We can't afford not to do it, and the cash is there.
Wilford, John, and Cyril, you keep circling this really critical and fundamental point, and it's so important that all of the things that we need to do depend on us, each individually. And so many of us, I mean, we talk about leaders. Leaders respond to votes and contributions. That's the bottom line. If we want to get their attention, we have to stop voting for the fools and start contributing and supporting individuals who are willing to make a difference in our planet. Not 10 years from now or 20 years from now, but right now as we move toward 2022. The other thing we have to remember is many of us actually inadvertently force the CEOs that we criticize so much to make the dumb decisions they make because we're holding them to an economic standard. We own stock in companies and we want large dividends. We have to learn to tighten our own belts, I believe, before the corporations are going to start paying attention. We also have to start recognizing that we need to start making sacrifices as individuals. We can't continue the gluttony and the consumption. We can't keep buying all the new toys and then expect an economy to say, okay, we can slow down or we can make changes. We have our hands on the levers of things. And each of you is telling us that in a very clear and distinct voice. You're telling us we have to pay attention. Thomas Jefferson said that when the people become inattentive to civic affairs, judges and assemblies, congresses and governors, and we can now add presidents to that list, all become wolves. And that's an insult to wolves on many occasions. So we have that chance. We can do extraordinary things. Please listen to the gifts each one of these speakers is giving us today. John, I think you wanted to say something too.
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, I maybe building on a couple of things that Cyril had said. His recommendations here have been to focus on where we can have the greatest impact. And I think it's certainly important there. I think the old growth forest, we talk about biodiversity. We also we talk about the food system, and it's something that pervades everything in farming and agriculture. The paradigm that we're in right now for agriculture is monocropping. It's one, a little bit more specifically, is more of kind of a cereal crop dominated agricultural system where everybody everywhere is growing cereal crops to feed the livestock. And if you fly from the West Coast to DC here, most of the US is farms. As you look down, it's boxes and squares of farms. And as you fly across Africa, most of the landscapes are farms as well. And as you go across most countries, you'll see the majority of the land is being impacted because of farming, the systems, and it's the tractors and all. Now, oftentimes, because of there's money to be made in milk and meat, cheap meat and cheap dairy products, we see a third of all of the maize and corn grown in the US fed to livestock. We see a third of all of our soy grown in the US fed to pigs in China. And when we look at the manure running out of the Mississippi watershed, when we look at all of the farms with the fertilizers and the other agrochemicals leaching into the Mississippi River, you can't drink the water in any of the states that you visit in the Midwest anymore, or you go along the Mississippi. I mean, so, and that's all coming out into the Gulf of Mexico. And I heard recently they found a new species of whale in the Gulf of Mexico. That whale doesn't have a chance. Every single year, there's megatons of poisons that are coming and creating this dead zone. And so these might not, whereas, you know, the Great Plains of the US or the Midwest, and these aren't biodiversity hotspots, but the key driver that is killing us there, that's also killing the Amazon with farmers growing soy, GMO maize. They're growing it to feed to cattle, or feeding cattle to sell cheap meat to, you know, to different countries around the world who are willing to. That system just keeps replicating itself, and it's won by businesses, make money off of it. I go to the World Food Program, the seed salesmen who want to sell the seed are moving faster and are getting more investment than we have here. So, you know, I think it's the model that we have needs to change the food systems for all ecosystems. And I think that with that, we need to do a lot more good. And I think we've got some voices on the panel here who are describing ways that we can do more good, but doing more good is not going to help us. We also have to stop doing the bad. We have to stop all of the nitrogen fertilizers that are poisoning our water, all of these same things. And so in our experience in agroforestry, if you need gobs of nitrogen to feed the future, nitrogen fixing trees are a much better option in an agricultural system. And I would put, because a lot of my words today would suggest that I'm usually very much against livestock and advocating for a vegan lifestyle. But the farmers and the people that I work with across Africa, and I try to help them achieve food security within just a matter of years. It's a lot easier when you have milk and eggs and other meat products in that. And when we're trying to end hunger, we realize that it's not Moose's 2 cows that are causing climate change. Livestock can probably play a role in a sustainable world. What agribusiness has done is unacceptable. And I think that system and anything that we can do to disrupt that, to stop supporting it, stop supporting the cheap meat, the cheap grain, and those GMOs that have been designed to be grown with the agrochemicals, the herbicides and stuff, we need to divorce ourselves from all of that. And I think trees are the way to eliminate the harmful agrochemicals in a growing system and to bring in the NPK that farms need. So I'm happy to answer questions on that, but I appreciate being able to kind of, I think, point to specifically that cereal monocropping and the livestock intensive confinement rearing. That stuff is disgusting. The laws are keeping us from even seeing what goes on behind there. You can't even walk into those things without, you know, their security guards escorting you away. We need to do a lot more good, and we also need to make sure that we're not supporting that bad stuff in any way. So thank you.
Wilford, you had your hand.
Yeah, I want to build on what you said, George, and what you said, John. One of the themes, which is all of us have to be doing a lot of things we're not doing and stop doing a lot of things that we're not doing. I want to read a short quote, which was the last thing that I wrote, probably about 3 o'clock in the morning in the new edition of In Our Hands. And it's driven me nuts ever since I've written it. It is unclear whether the human race, at its current level of development as a species, has the maturity and wisdom, individually and collectively, to do what is needed, or in the time it is needed. And what drives me to distraction about what I wrote is those last 5 words, in the time that it is needed. So either we could take that as a fatalistic approach, oh my God, we're all doomed, or we could take it as an impetus for all of us to rise and get on with it this decade. And I think all of us could get into the reason why I'm emphasizing that this decade is either we bend the curve on global warming and therefore climate change, or we don't. And therefore, I just want to really emphasize the opportunity we now have because of the connectedness that we can all be as one mobilized force to really put our shoulder to the wheel now, not tomorrow, now, to do what is ours to do. In some cases, it may be, as someone mentioned, just voting for the right people. In other cases, it is doing much more because you're the head of a corporation. Or in my case, it's teaching. I don't care, just get on with it, please. Thank you.
Go ahead, Cyril.
Just to return to your initial question, Tom, about what provides hope. And I think, we're all concerned about getting enough done in a short enough period of time to avoid climate catastrophe and biodiversity catastrophe and extinction. I think one of the things that provides hope, and it's a double-edged sword because it generates a lot of stress and discomfort as well, but it's just the amount of waste in the system. And I think John is referring to this a little bit, but in my work on forests, I can just provide lots of examples of just catastrophic behavior that could easily be done away with if people were just more aware of it. And I'll just give one example. But the EU has decided that burning trees is sustainable, and that they have just decreed in their policies that it's okay to burn biofuels. And they have declared that sustainable, and they have declared that they won't count the emissions from burning trees and burning forests in their reporting to the Climate Change Convention, because they deem it sustainable. So what does that mean? So what that means is that they need a supply of trees. So where are those trees going to come from? Well, they say, they're going to come from waste, from production of wood, timber, pulp, whatever it is. We'll collect the waste and burn that. The reality is that a lot of trees are being clear cut in North America and being shipped to the UK for burning in a facility. So you cut the trees, you lose the carbon that way. You transport the trees by putting them on a boat and shipping them from sometimes the southeastern US, but sometimes the west coast of North America. And you ship those to England, and then you burn them, and nobody counts those emissions because the emissions don't exist, because the EU said they don't exist. Some of those trees are 1,000-year-old old growth trees. They're from one of the most endangered forests on the planet, and one of the most unique ecosystems on the planet, which is a temperate inland rainforest in British Columbia, and which dips into the US a little bit in a few places. Most temperate rainforests are coastal. You think of the Tongass rainforest in Alaska as a coastal temperate rainforest. But there are occasional and very rare inland temperate rainforests, and this is one of the few examples around the planet. And they are taking 1,000-year-old trees out of this place and shipping them to the UK for burning. There are lots of examples like this where you have just mind-blowing, deeply frustrating, agonizing examples of completely ridiculous and absurd and unsustainable activity that could be easily eliminated if people were aware of what's going on. So, I think just to wrap up this point, there is a huge amount of waste in the system because people don't know it's there, and there is a lot of margin for getting rid of that if we, get the right message out and get the levels of awareness raised. So there's actually a huge amount we can do. We're not even scratching the surface of what we could do to solve the problem, which is one of the reasons why I think there isn't much time left, but there is a lot we can do. So anyway, just needed to throw that out. Good and bad.
Thank you, Cyril. Wilford, you've got a comment?
Yeah, I do. I want to switch to one of the questions that was in the chat, and that is, how do we evolve away from global capitalism? I think it requires two things. One is, if you leave businesses are only interested in making a profit. Hopefully they want to do it legally. Okay. And therefore the system in which they operate needs to change so that they need to change to be responsive. The first thing that has to happen is that we as a consumer need to put pressure on corporations saying, we're not going to buy your product. That's something we can easily do. A second is as an employee to put pressure on our company to do the right thing. It may be, why are you wasting fresh water when you could be using gray water? Okay. And the third, as an investor, my point is we as individuals have a huge amount of power, which we are not exercising. If we become activists, we can really help make that change. The second is we as the voter have the opportunity to put pressure on our governments to change the incentives and disincentive systems that are in operation in which corporations are acting. So if they don't care how they make a profit, so long as I said they do it hopefully legally, and if we change the subsidies that we provide or the subsidies that we remove, the taxes that we imply, they will respond because corporations are very nimble. Right now, many corporations are the bad guys. I actually feel that because of the length of time that we have, corporations need to be turned into the most nimble, most effective entities to bring about the change that we need. But we are the ones that have to drive that process with government and directly as consumers, employees, and investors. Thank you.
Cyril, if I can add one more piece to your leverage that we have as individuals, it's also important to remember, at least here in the United States, that 90% of the dollars that government operates on, other than the dollars they print, are our tax dollars. 90% of the money that they waste or spend on things that we don't want them to spend are money that we give them. And although the 16th Amendment gives the government the right to taxation, it doesn't give the government the right to be fools. It doesn't give the government the right to waste our money. It doesn't give the government the right not to spend money on things that support the well-being of humanity. And eventually we have to wake up to that fact. We have a huge leverage.
Yep.
As Wilford says, and we need to start using it intelligently, honestly, peacefully, every single day. And above all, we need to start using it consciously every day.
Hear, hear.
All of the issues that have been addressed by John and Cyril and Wilford today all demand our conscious, active participation, and we can make a really significant difference. And we need to remind people in government that they actually work for us. They're our employees. They're not our masters. And if we can remind them of that, we can begin to make some of the changes that really need to happen and happen quickly. Yes.
Well said.
Maybe just picking up on some of the conversation, something Cyril, you said a while ago, and then Wilford, your comment about time. I look at my own personal journey. I grew up on a small family farm. I've spent my life out in nature as much as possible. I made personal choices about not buying plastic about a decade or a dozen years ago, and looking at my food and my diet and moving to a vegetarian diet a decade ago, and meeting with my financial advisor and reconfiguring my portfolio, and doing all of these things. But it's taken me a couple of decades to get to where I am now, and we don't have that kind of time. We've got this decade. And how do we move people through what needs to happen in this decade, and picking up on John's comment, the food agricultural sector uses about 25% of the energy on the planet. The amount of waste is horrendous. How do we move people through this education process and behavior change process in this decade? What's it going to take, and what do we need to do to make that happen in the limited time that we have left?
I'll share it quickly that, I think to address this, we're trying to work top down and bottom up. I think bottom up is grassroots and working with farmers, and they want it. Farmers want this change. They don't want to destroy their land. They want it. The communities want it. So I think, working with farmers, and we've got 40,000, we're trying to go to 250,000 is a big part of it. Top down for us in my room here, I got too many papers, I'm afraid to say. One of them, though, is a list of the top 50 food companies in the world. And so how do we have immediate change is by working, based on everything else I talked today about how agriculture is impacting and degrading ecosystems, by working top down with food companies, or perhaps through their investors or the robo-banks that are lending them money, but by working through the food systems and making sure that they know how to source regenerative food that's grown sustainably. Mars is doing a great job and has been. And of all the food companies, I'm not working with them now, but I've seen them, and in Instagram, they say the planet's dying, we need to change. And granted, they're dealing with almonds and coconut and cocoa and all the things that they have to source. You think about the major food companies who are moving all of this stuff, introduce them to us, help. We can, the same agroforestry that's helping end hunger and poverty for Rose and 40,000 other families in our program right now, are the same techniques that can help those food companies take this to scale. We do need the private sector to help clean up their mess. I feel like my last 30 years has been cleaning up behind the private sector and behind the smallholder farmers who've been farming and clearing and killing the watersheds. And then here we come trying to help. We need those food companies of the world to, not just have a sustainability desk, but to specifically integrate agroforestry into all of their food production systems, not only for, smallholder farmers, but on the larger scale as well. And in any type of kind of system, however you define it, we can get rid of the agrochemicals, we can get rid of the excess nitrogen, we can get rid of the runoff, we can add a lot of trees into those systems. It's better for the soil, it's going to be better for the birds and the biodiversity and the small things and the bats and the bees and everything else. If we can eliminate the agrochemicals, trees can kind of replace them. So I think that, introduce us to companies that want to do this. It's easy for me right now to work with the cocoa companies. I'm working with coffee companies, people who grow things in the tropics, and for which agroforestry is not a big surprise. But everything grows better in a forest garden. Everything. Cotton, we're working with cotton growers to make it regenerative. Even oil palm, which is usually grown in terrible, terrible, terrible ways that kills biodiversity, it's a tree-based crop that produces an incredible amount of energy. Like, it can indeed be grown in a very regenerative way. You could take degraded areas in certain places and integrate the pollen. So, everything can grow sustainably with trees in agroforestry. The trees are fixing nitrogen through their roots. They're also dropping gobs and gobs of leaf litter to build up the topsoil. They're sending roots deep down into the soil, and they're pulling up other micronutrients that plants need to survive as well. You don't need a lot of boron and all these other things, but it needs to be available so that the plants don't have deficiencies in magnesium or something like that. So the trees can do it. And I think working with the big food companies to make sure that they're sourcing, we're honored to be working on the Great Green Wall initiative. And I think we have some people in the community here who are advocates of the Great Green Wall. How do we grow a Great Green Wall in the next few years and not take 30 years doing this? The food companies and others who are purchasing food from the zone, if they're committed to buying, millet and sorghum for the beer company, that they want to brew beer, but you need to source these types of grains You know, if people do start sourcing from farmers who are growing products in agroforestry systems, I think that immediate change, there is a certification, there's a regenerative agriculture certification, there's other types of certifications that help companies, private sector, purchase more confidently from farmers who are growing things. But I think it's within that kind of general private sector driven trajectory. We need to hijack the power of big business and help them see how they can be just better forces for change. Otherwise, it's great, all the grassroots work that we're doing bottom up, but we're going to have to meet them in the middle. As the big corporations are coming to say, okay, we do want to source cotton in Tanzania that's not grown in ways that's degrading central Tanzania next to the parks there. We're working to grow cotton in regenerative ways with things so that the t-shirt company can source cotton that's helping a landscape rather than hurting. We're doing that with the cotton cooperatives right now in Tanzania. So as soon as we sell the buyers on the idea that it's worth investing and buying, you know, this quality versus something else, I think the chain can start to speed up. And I think we all know, we put it in the chat here, we all have these expectations already. We need to find how do we share these same common expectations with all the other consumers out there. But I don't know, top down, bottom up. I welcome your advice and guidance and hear how other people are trying to do it as well.
Wilford, Cyril, what are your thoughts on how do we get done what needs to get done in this decade?
Well, I'll just jump in. I think from a top-down perspective, I think this discussion is right. A big part of the issue is the money. And the hundreds of billions of dollars going to the wrong places. And that seems like an enormous ask, and yet it isn't. If you're looking at the dialogue that's happening in the Convention on Biological Diversity and in the Climate Convention, this is now pretty much accepted as a given that the subsidies are a problem and that they need to change. That's an astonishing result. I didn't expect that a few years ago. So that's a big change, and that's really, really encouraging. Now, the problem is, of course, that even if you end those subsidies, there's no guarantee that an idiot politician won't spend it on something equally stupid. So the fact that we've recognized the problem does not mean that we recognize the solution. But that is still, a huge moment, just like understanding the importance of forests in the climate change equation is a huge moment, even if people haven't figured out yet the old growth forests are the top priority. So that's big. The other element of how we affect change is, I think, we can lift this out of the chat and into the conversation is, quite frankly, to diversify this group and to bring in youth and people from around the world. And I think if we do diversify, and we do bring in youth to the decision making, we can, make a lot of positive change, because a lot of the things that we're still debating, they accepted, 5 years ago and have moved on. So I think that's a big part of it. And I think the simple message from the forest standpoint is, the three best things you can do are to protect an old growth forest. You will never go wrong if you do that. To allow a degraded forest to recover, if you can find a way to retire the logging in that forest, or to just pay someone to allow that forest to be protected, that's your second biggest bang for the buck. And then, also in terms of reforestation, it's very cheap. If there used to be a forest somewhere, to just let it come back. You don't even need to plant trees sometimes. Just let it grow back. Let the birds and the mammals reseed that area naturally. And it takes a little bit longer, but it can be done. So I think, those three things, if people are looking for things to do, you won't go wrong if you allow the forest to come back, if you allow the forest to age, or if you protect an already old forest. Those three things always help. And I'll just throw in two last statistics, just because I'm running out of time, and these numbers are astonishing. One is, of the 4 billion hectares of forest left on the planet, we've already lost a third of the world's forests. We've got 4 billion hectares left. Of that, just over a quarter is old growth forest. So we've lost 30% of the forest we have left. Less than a third is old growth. So we're losing it incredibly fast. But here's another point. Of those 4 billion hectares, only about 7% is plantations. And yet that already produces half of the industrial roundwood. So we don't need to be trashing forests. We've got a lot of wood already. We trash forests because it's easy and because it's subsidized. So that's a really important point. And here's the last clincher point, I hope, that's going to make everyone's jaw drops. 1% of the trees around the world hold 50% of the carbon, right? What are those trees? Those are the big old trees. 1% holds 50%. Now, that statistic is a little bit skewed because that assumes that you're counting everything in the forest, from a tiny seedling to a little sapling to a small, medium-sized tree to the big trees. But 1% holds 50%. That tells you that anything you do to an old growth forest is going to be unsustainable, at the very least from a climate standpoint. So that's one of those mind-boggling, tidbits that is really important, because it tells you really all you need to know. Logging an old growth forest is never going to be sustainable in our lifetimes. So
I'll share quickly, Cyril, if I can, building on your experience with kind of the wood and the wood waste and extra wood, because in our experience working with smallholder farmers, oftentimes you see that energy and the need for firewood is a driver of deforestation. 16% of, and what we found in our programs is that when farmers shift from monocropping into agroforestry, from the living fence around their field and the rows of nitrogen fixing trees across their field, the dispersed fruit trees that they have, they're pruning those trees, they're pruning them, they're sprouting back, they're harvesting the leaves and mixing them into the soil, they're pruning their fruit trees, they're pruning their timber trees. They're able to get most of their firewood just from the dead wood that you described. And so the people who've been in our program for 3 or 4 years, they grew Forest Garden. We don't hear the words like firewood is shortage. And, in the beginning of the program on a landscape, you hear that, oh, we need firewood. There's entire organizations that are dedicated. We're going to plant trees so that people have firewood. Like, no, they're in the wrong solution, wrong tree planting solution for the wrong place. We move into an agroforestry paradigm. I think we will. We'll find tremendous efficiencies and solutions to problems that really shouldn't be there in the first place. So, yeah, thank you.
Wilford, over to you regarding the time and how do we move things, and any other points you'd like to throw into the mix.
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. What gives me hope, and that gets into action. One is these young activists. In the back of my car, I've got this little thing. I'm with Greta. Okay, and that's symbolic of how these young people are speaking truth to power. Now we've got to mobilize the older people to do exactly the same thing. Everybody's got to get off their backside and move on this issue now, this decade. Okay, and so that's really my key message. And the second is, I am really excited. I've been saying for quite some time, we need a global mobilization. Well, Humanity Rising is the best example I've seen of getting people from around the world to, as a somewhat single voice, say, yes, this is our time, we have to do it. So I am encouraged by a fundamental shift in energy right now, because people are, whether you read the newspaper, you on television, whatever, you're hearing the same voice that is basically the energy that is in the room right now, about we don't have a lot of time. It's up to us. It's not up to someone else. We have to do our part. So I'm obviously am on my preacher mode right now in saying, come on, we all can do this. There's no obstacle. It's a lack of individual, collective, and political will. That is ours to do, whether we're here, Nigeria, China, or wherever, to get on with it. So that's my last comment. Thanks, Tom.
Wilford, if you think Humanity Rising has done great stuff in the past, wait until you see what's coming down the pipe.
I love it.
Wait,
All with you, George.
and wait until you see what's coming down Mr. Eddington's pipe as Endangered becomes a global enterprise.
Yeah.
You know, and I think, Tom, shall we invite Mr. Humanity Rising back into the conversation? Are we close enough to that time?
Yeah, I was just going to ask if you had any closing comments from anybody else before Jim joins us again.
I'll just say something quickly. I think we're all trying to make a little bit of, not a little bit, but a major shift in our own lives, in our companies, in our thinking. A new shift for me this year is Trees for the Future has been growing a lot in recent years, and we've been trying to respond directly to these challenges that we face. I've been the CEO for 8-9 years now, and it's actually just now knowing I need to spend more of my time. The company's growing, the company, you all know, running companies is a lot of work. I'm shifting into a chief strategy officer position so that I can be with all of you on the front lines a lot more day to day through this year, starting literally yesterday. I'm trying to shift over. We've got some wonderful people who are joining our team and our leadership team so that we can continue to kind of grow projects and all. But just as all of us are trying to put a lot more of our time and resources and talents onto solving the thing professionally here at Trees for the Future, and I myself, I'm really able to dedicate all of my time now, working with key stakeholders to advance what we described here today. So I'm here with you. I'm hoping to actually be able to work with many of you more going into the future as we build this. So that's a little bit of an update and my final words on my end. I appreciate all the nice words in the chat here, and the panelists are wonderful too. I'm looking forward to connecting with everybody more.
Wilford, Cyril, any closing comments from you before we bring Jim back in?
Well, just, from my personal standpoint, I see this as, something that I'm going to be working on for the next 5 years, maybe, maybe to 2030, since that seems to be a target date in some of the international negotiations happening at the UN level. So the short message is any support we can get, over the next 5 to 8 years is wonderful. And, in the next few years, my goal is to diversify the tiny NGO that we just started, diversify our advisory group, and then hand it over to someone much younger. Hopefully they take it over the finish line, and we can watch and applaud as they do so.
Well, thank you all. And I think with that, Jim, we'll have you join us again.
Thank you, Tom. I'll say a few words and then I'll hand it back to you to say a couple of comments on what's going to come up for tomorrow. But I really want to thank, this has been one of the most stellar panels we've had on Humanity Rising. So I just want to thank you for your intelligence, your passion, and your deep commitment to these issues. And Wilford, thank you for that affirmation of Humanity Rising. We are doing our best to help nudge things along. And within that context, I'd like to make the following comment. Having experienced the trajectory of Humanity Rising and COP26 and various other developments, it feels to me that in addition to the fact that we are running out of time from an ecological integrity, planetary point of view, that there are two pressures that are now interlocking. And the first one, obviously, is escalating ecological turbulence. But the other one that I think is very important for us to note is the rise of authoritarianism and the fact that right at the moment of crisis, when the governments are clearly stating as they did in COP26, that they're not really going to solve the problem. They're also working to limit protest, to limit electoral representation, to engage in all kinds of circumscribing of the ability of people anywhere to speak freely and to organize freely to take action. That is being constrained, almost proportional to the escalating problem that we need to solve. And that's creating a vice grip on humanity, because the very instrumentalities that we need to activate are being taken away in almost every country in the world. I've been arrested half a dozen times for civil disobedience in the 70s and 80s when I, was a young man running around with a knife between my teeth. Those penalties back then no longer exist. You get arrested now for protesting at the Pentagon or in front of major corporations, and they're felonies, not misdemeanors. So I don't want to belabor the point, but I think we need to understand that when we encourage people to act, we need to bear in mind that the scope for action is being intentionally constrained. And one of the things we've seen over the last 2 years of COVID is essentially the police state. It's a martial law. We've been in lockdown. We're forced into social distancing. And I don't want to get into the issues around COVID per se, but to say that our governments are very sophisticated now in how they constrain our mobility and our freedom of expression. So the comment that I wanted to make as a result of that we're trying as much as we can through Humanity Rising, is that it feels to me, in addition to the individual actions that all of you are very rightly pointing toward, and I think your comment, Tom, is really important, that the maturation of our awareness and then the maturation of how we shift our behavior patterns takes time. It's like growing a tree. People very seldom change in a day. They change over time, and we don't have that much time anymore.
Right.
So the one thing that we've been emphasizing is, what could the movement do as a movement? There are, according to Paul Hawken, well over 10 million NGOs in the world. And most of them are operating completely independently of one another. So as I sit back and contemplate things, it feels to me that the one place where, if we could do it, we would make the most difference in the shortest period of time, would be to somehow, and you made the comment, Wilford, about a kind of a global mobilization. We keep promoting this and pressing this through Humanity Rising, that if the movement, even just the climate movement, would come together between the more radical direct action wing, the Extinction rebellions of the world, and the more moderate flank, as Rupert Reed calls it, much of the work that you all are doing, Humanity Rising is doing, we would have both the numbers and the collective impact to do something. So I wanted to just put in the mix, as we draw this session to a close, not only the constraints, but an additional opportunity for the kind of radical collaboration, and that is organizational collaboration in the face of the current crisis that needs radically and rapidly to be solved. So those would be the quick comments that I would make, in deep appreciation for everything that you all are doing on the front lines of social justice and ecological regeneration. So thank you. And Tom, I'll turn it back over to you to say something about tomorrow, then we'll close out.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. It's been a fantastic day today. It's been a terrific week. Tomorrow, we've got another amazing lineup of panelists. We're being joined by Father Jostrom Karithadam from the Vatican Dicastery on Integral Human Development. He's the author of the 10 Green Commandments, has a PhD in ecological studies, and has done a beautiful job of connecting social justice and ecology. We'll be joined by Dr. Elvis Tanjum he's a coordinator of the Great Green Wall Project with the African Union. And he'll be presenting and talking about the work being done there. Probably the greatest gift when the Great Green Wall Project is completed, an 8,000 kilometer long reforestation project in sub-Saharan Africa, probably the greatest contribution humanity will make to the earth. We'll be joined by Lynn Twist, co-founder of the Pachamama Alliance, the Soul of Money author, many years with the Hunger Project, and we'll be joined by Charles Eisenstein, author, lecturer, and a brilliant thinker around ecology and how do we move from this notion that it's either the environment or ecology. And then on Friday, we'll be joined by Vandana Shiva. Many of you know her and her incredible work in India and throughout the world. So we've got a couple more terrific days of discussions and dialogue and panelists. So please join us again tomorrow and Friday.
Thank you.
Thanks
very much, everyone. And I would just say, in the spirit of this dialogue and in the spirit of what Sylvia Earle said yesterday about knowledge being critical in the liberation of our world. You know, it's the truth that sets us free. And there's been a lot of truth in this week, Tom and George. So I want to just acknowledge that and thank you. And Wilford, John, and Cyril, again, I salute you. You're on the front lines. And it's people like you, collectively, if we could only figure out how to come together, that would change this thing in the way that all of us know needs changing at the scale and within the time frame that we also know to be true. So thank you all. I invite everyone to join our after chat session. You'll see the link in the chat box. All of you panelists are welcome to join. You received the link in the letter that Matt Robertson sent to you. We'll say bye for now, and we'll see you all again here tomorrow on Humanity Rising, same time, same station, for our 4th day of Endangered Global.
Thank you
Thanks
all
so much. Bye for now. Good one, guys.
Yeah, great session. That was fun.